You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Your host, Michael, on a Thursday evening. What we're doing today is asking the question, does the traditional Latin Mass offer more grace? And, of course, we're speaking about in relation to the post-conciliar liturgy, the liturgical reforms that came with Paul VI and, of course, John Paul II. So does the traditional Latin Mass offer more grace than the Novus Ordo, to put it plainly? And in order to discuss this, I'm bringing on my friend Kevin Symonds. He's going to be on in just a moment to talk about this topic. It has been something that has been coming up a lot lately, and I thought he would be a good person to bring on and just talk about the issues in general, merit in general in relation to the liturgy, and then we'll deal with the topic itself, and then maybe some other things. We'll see how it goes. All right, bringing Kevin on coming up next. Kevin, welcome back to the show, and how are you?
Hi, I'm doing okay. I noticed you called me your friend, so it's like I want to note that.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot too lately, so definitely a friend, and also somebody that I respect when it comes to theology. I think you've done really good work, especially when it comes to the issues with Fatima. So definitely got to commend you there. So I think you're a good person to have this discussion with. So let's talk a little bit about the liturgy and merit in relation to the liturgy, and let's maybe dive into the topic at hand after that. Let's just talk in general. Let me ask this: is it the case that the individual is able to merit more from a mass based on their own personal disposition? Let's start there.
Ooh, you're going right for the jugular, right from the outset, huh? I think there's a lot of truth to that in a way, because like the more disposed we are to God in general, even outside of a liturgical context, like for instance, the Blessed Virgin Mary was not in a liturgical context proper. She wasn't in the Jewish synagogue when the Archangel Gabriel appeared to her and said to her, "Kere kaharatomene, ho kyrios meta su," hail full of grace, who hath been graced, the Lord is with you. So she was totally disposed to God's grace. So there's this kind of a Marian element there, and her fiat is meant to be an entire thing about it's meant to be like we're meant to model that Mary's fiat in our own lives. So I think that the more disposed we are towards God in general in the spiritual life, that then helps tremendously with the liturgical rites and how we understand God and receive Him better when we're actually present physically at Mass.
So say the Blessed Virgin Mary is at a Mass and Pope Pius XII is also at the same Mass. One is going to merit more grace than the other. Would that be the case? And of course, it would be the Virgin Mary who would merit more. But they're at the same Mass, and yet one merits more grace. You would agree, correct?
I would be inclined to say so, simply just because of the nature of Our Lady being the kaharatomene. So I mean,
and we could even change the analogy and say, well, maybe Pope Liberius and Pope Pius V both attend a liturgy. St. Pius V, and of course, Liberius has not been canonized and had that issue back then. So they both attend a liturgy. Just kind of all things being equal, we would probably say that Pius V most likely would be better disposed to merit more grace. Let me put it that way. Would you agree with that?
My knowledge of Pope Liberius is a little weak, but if I remember correctly, I'd have to say yes to your thought. Yes.
In other words, it's the person who is properly disposed and how well they are disposed that receives grace. It's not that, okay, well, there's a different amount offered for each individual. The way I see it is the same amount of grace is offered to every individual, regardless of which form of the liturgy they attend, which rite, and as long as it is a valid mass, the same amount of grace is offered. But some of us might have a larger cup, if you will, to receive that grace than others. In other words, the Virgin Mary would have this gigantic chalice, and grace pours forth into the chalice. She receives that grace in a very larger way than maybe my little tiny wooden cup, right? So she's able to contain, she's able to hold, if you will, more grace. And yet the same amount of grace is offered to both of us, but her cup is much larger than mine, so it's able to retain more.
Is it a question of the size of the cup, or as much as it is what's already inside of the cup, be it like dirt and filth that could take up the place where grace could already be in?
I'm sure that impacts it too. I'm sure that impacts it too. But I kind of see it as the same amount of grace is being offered to all, but there are some who have a larger cup to receive grace than others. There are some who are better disposed than others. We're all given the same potentially amount of grace, but there are some personal factors that can be at play there that would determine how much we merit at the liturgy. So then let's take it to the topic at hand. Is it the case that you would say perhaps some forms might offer more grace than others, some forms of the liturgy?
Well, this is where I think that, in terms of like what we speak in terms of the distinction in Latin theology over ex opere operato versus ex opere operantis, the sacrament is confected no matter what. That's ex opere operato. Now how well we are disposed, how well we receive things, that's the operantis aspect of it. I do think that there is something to be said, however, for a ritual that is used and how things speak of it. And if I may, I want to kind of give like a personal story to maybe just to kind of set some of the foundation to understand what I'm talking about. Several years ago, I was engaging in conversation with somebody that I knew in college who was at the North American College. He later went to the NAC, that is, North American College. And he said something to me that really upset me. It really made me fly off the handle. Because basically what he said was, so long as the words of consecration are valid, he said nothing else, everything else is secondary, it doesn't really matter. And I about blew my lid, because I shot back at him and I was like, excuse me, no. I think you've got this a little backwards, not backwards. I think it's this a little mistaken here. Holy Mother Church puts forth these rites around the celebration of the mystery of the Eucharist itself. And she does so with intent, purpose, meaning, and everything else. But the overall idea is that they're meant to design to help you to understand, to draw close to Christ in the mysteries. So a few weeks ago, I don't remember which program we were talking about, which program we were on, but I made the point about the romancing the liturgy. And I had said that like the rubrics are like the book that helps you to understand what the church expects. And with this language of love, and I drew the analogy with a married couple. There are things that you can do that are like goofy, and your spouse may be like, you may get like a polite smile, but like it's not really deeply pleasing. Well, similarly, with respect to the relationship between the priest and the church, these things are there, and they're meant to help us to understand, to draw us closer to Christ in the mysteries. And so we can't, yes, they're not those don't constitute necessarily the validity of the Mass necessarily, but it's like hand in glove. They go together very, very tightly and very closely. I've attended some Masses where I'm sitting here and I'm shaking my head. Like, I was actually in August of 1999, they were swing dancing the responsorial psalm. I kid you not. I was in the first or second row and I'm watching these people do these theatrics in front of me. And I sat there and my mind was just like blown, like, and not with joy or glee or pleasure. I was horrified. And somebody commented to me later on, they were like, yeah, I kind of thought you'd have a problem with that. And I'm like, you think? I'll never forget that as long as I live. And these things are abuses. It is true, the old Latin saying, abusus non tollat usum, the abuse of a thing does not take away its use. But, they're meant to draw us closer to Christ. And so over time, the church then would revise or put forth different things for the faithful in accordance with things that are happening historically. And this is kind of what happened at Vatican II. The church said there are some things that we need to kind of curtail. There have been these accretions or things that crept up over time, but don't really serve a purpose now. And that's fine. That's totally within the church's prerogative, But it doesn't come to the question of the ex opere operato, because if you start messing with that, now you're starting to mess with the indefectibility of the church, and directly with the heart of her mission of the salvation of souls. That's not good either. So we have to be very careful, or as your readers like to use the word, you have to make sure you're nuanced with these issues. But like, I see it in my own life. Like sometimes people living in many places around the world, they're living in very unedifying liturgical lives in their parishes, and so a lot of people then go to the extraordinary form, the traditional Latin Mass, where things are very, very well put. It's very structured. And they're like, oh my goodness, I myself have experienced it. It's like a breath of fresh air. There's such beauty there in that. And I'd go to both, ordinary or extraordinary form. I'd go to both. Unfortunately, it's not offered here in my parish, here in my town, but but it doesn't mean that I'm not receiving Jesus. Either if I go to the Novus Ordo, let's say, but we have to be careful not to give distractions like swing dancing, the responsorial psalm at Mass. That kind of stuff is not good. But if we do what is set forth by Holy Mother Church and in accordance with the great tradition, I think that we can make a really strong argument that there are these, that, even with the Novus Ordo, things can be done if they're done in accordance with the mind of the church, it's actually really beautiful still, and you're still receiving grace. So, subjective dispositions aside, you're still receiving grace, but it is incumbent upon us to cooperate with that grace. So I'll get off my soapbox here.
Some people are going to inevitably ask the question, well, does that then mean that if you were to consider a clown mass and then consider the TLM, you're saying that they objectively offer the same amount of grace? What say ye?
Oh dear. Well, with respect to the sacrament itself, presuming the validity of things, I think there's a lot that's impeded.
Yeah.
At this point, in a sense, I think it's a good word. It's impeded.
Yes.
So for instance, I do a lot of work with writing and editing and grammar stuff. And actually, just before, when we were in the chat room, somebody didn't use a comma correctly, and the sentence came off like, "To age, thank God." I have to remember my age, thank God. But I have to remember my age, comma, thank God. Two different things, you see. But that's like it's impeded. And for a grammarian, it's like, wait a minute. Or that one expression that I see on memes a lot is "let's eat, Grandpa" versus "let's eat, comma, Grandpa." One, you're saying let's eat your grandfather. The other one is no, it's the hortatory subjunctive. Grandpa, come on, let's go eat. So the expression was, use a comma, save a life. But I see this all the time. Even when I was a teacher, and I was reading the essays or something, or the term papers. I wasn't an English teacher. I wasn't looking for perfect prose. As long as I could see the point being communicated, okay. But at the same time, if I have to do more work to figure that out, it's more of a struggle. It just doesn't come easy. Mm-hmm. And I think we can make a similar analogy with the liturgy. And when people are doing things that they're not supposed to be doing, there's a certain impeding there. And the more I have to fight and struggle with things, especially like if I'm getting angry and I'm at these abuses, like for instance, sitting there watching the swing dancing responsorial psalm, I definitely was not a happy camper. Mm-hmm. I'll give you another example. I was over in Rome for the Easter, for Holy Week in 2002 under the reign of St. John Paul II. And there was a female dressed in clerics, complete with the collar and everything. And she was over. I saw her outside, and then she was standing over to my right. And she must have thought she was Catholic, because I think she was Catholic, because I saw her go up and receive Holy Communion. I was infuriated, absolutely infuriated by this. But nobody made a scene. This was St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope is right there. Ratzinger was also there before he was Pope. So if these things are happening, they can impede us, but that doesn't necessarily still mean that the grace isn't there from God. It becomes a lot harder, I think, to receive it or to see it. And that's not good. That's not the purpose of liturgy.
And in these cases, it's not the sacrament itself or even the form and expression of the liturgy promulgated by the church that is the impediment. It's people who are there who are putting impediments between God and his people, such as clown masses and things like that. So I think it's unfair whenever people even try to make that comparison. And if somebody were to take the position, well, the Missal 62 objectively offers the same amount of grace as the Missal of Paul VI. And then somebody says, well, then that means that the Latin Mass offers the same amount of grace as a clown mass, or the clown mass offers the same amount of grace. And they're using that rhetorically to try to get you to reject that position. But the point is, it's not the mass promulgated by the church that is somehow an impediment here. It is liturgical abuse that is the impediment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is kind of like one of the issues is like if somebody's impeding things, they're obviously doing a grave disservice, first to God, to themselves, but also the people that are there. If it's a priest, I mean. Now, this is where we get into some of the finer issues of, well, for instance, the inherent structure of the Novus Ordo is, does things. So one of the arguments that I've heard, and I actually happen to agree with to a limited extent, is the priest facing versus populum versus ad orientem. Facing east versus the people, or towards the people, right? Mm-hmm. I am not a big fan of versus populum, and I've heard it from priests when they say that it just makes so much more sense ad orientem. Sure. And they feel like there's so much less pressure on them to perform or to entertain. But I from one liturgist said to me, Kevin, when you actually look at the rubrics of the Novus Ordo, they actually presume ad orientem.
Yep.
And I'm like, really? They're like, yeah.
Yep.
See, I'm not a liturgist. I'm not a sacramental theologian.
Sure.
But I had these interesting conversations with people, and I'm like, really? Someday I may get to look more into that. But yeah, it's fascinating nonetheless. And so if they presume that, well, then why aren't we doing it? Right. Well, this is where we get into the questions of pastoral practice, not wanting to upset the apple cart, et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole conversation unto itself.
Sure.
But I think there's something to be said for this, especially for the priest, because then we don't have these rock star priests, the celebrity priests. They feel like they have to perform to get things done and make the people happy and clappy. yeah, that's again, that's like going back to the husband and wife analogy. It's nice, but it's not pleasing. And why would you want to grieve the Spirit of God? Why
Yeah,
would you want to do that?
yeah, and it's been one of our longest practices and traditions to face liturgical east during the liturgy. So I see no good reason to change that. I see absolutely no good reason to overturn that. Any argument that somebody can offer for versus populum to me never outweighs, well, this is a practice that was given to us by the apostles that you can find in the New Testament itself, where Christ is coming from the east. And so the apostles would face east in prayer, and Ratzinger himself even notes it's a tradition that goes back to the apostles. I don't know any argument that could overturn that one. Um, so to me, I'm extremely in favor of ad orientem. So I'm right there with you. But you're right. What has been officially promulgated assumes ad orientem. It's more in practice that we experience some of these issues.
Mhm.
Um, you know,
Yeah, I've heard it jokingly referred to in a story once. Somebody went up to the priest to complain and said, something like, "Father, I couldn't hear you." And he looked at her and said, "That's okay, honey. I wasn't talking to you." You know, and I'm like, "Oh snap! If that actually happened, if I was in earshot and heard that, I'd be like, did I just hear what I thought I just heard?" There's some truth behind it, though. It's like, no, you're facing God. It's talking to God. You are presenting. You're all, first of all, you're standing in the same direction, and you're presenting. You're that go-between. It's that mediator theology behind in the priesthood and the liturgy, and it really does accentuate that.
it just makes sense. Anything that is said that is addressed to God, one should face liturgical east. And anything that the priest says that is addressed to the congregation should face the congregation. It's a really simple rule, and I don't know why
Mhm. Well,
that's
see,
such a big
I've
deal.
seen it done even in the extraordinary form. The priest turns around and says to everybody, "Dominus vobiscum,"
Right.
you know, and turns around and goes back to the altar. It goes faces the
Right.
altar proper.
Right.
So it's even there. So I would ask again. I'm not a liturgist, but I would ask: is that the kind of thing that's presumed in the Novus Ordo
Yes.
rubrics? Where like the turning around, is it something like that? And then he goes back and does ad
It
orientem.
does it does presume that in the rubrics. That's the thing. And so a lot of people actually think that this has been officially changed, that versus populum was an official change. That's not the case. Again, the missal itself assumes ad orientem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but let me ask this, because there are a lot of people that are going to say, look, why is this even being discussed? I mean, how does this even practically affect us, right? Aren't you guys just dealing with this intellectual ivory tower kind of scenario? How does this actually impact us, this particular topic?
Well, I suppose there's different ways we could look at that, but there are people who take this very seriously. This isn't some esoteric or archaic view of theology. This isn't a random topic. Um, there are people out there who take these sort of things very seriously, where they've done some very questionable things in terms of sacramental theology. So, for instance, I'm in a position to reveal that there's alleged, I should say, a group of people priests, who have submitted themselves to something called supplied rites or supplying of ceremonies. These are priests who are said to have doubts about the validity of their orders, or other people have doubts about their validity or orders and they're concerned about this. And so they find they find a friendly bishop who uh, has questions about some of these things too, and they take the old rite of ordination prior to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which has extra prayers and stuff like that in the ritual, and these guys, they don't necessarily think that they're not ordained validly, but they believe in this concept called supplemental right, supplying of, I can't remember what it is, applying of ceremonies. And they go through this, whatever it is with this bishop, whoever the bishop may be. And sorry, somebody just texted me. And they go through these extra prayers are said from the old ritual. And it is believed that this gives these priests more juice, so to speak. It somehow jazzes up their priesthood. And they argue that the ex opere, this is about ex opere operantis, that somehow they are getting more disposed in some way to God's grace by going through this thing. I have problems with this in terms of sacramental theology, because if old or the prior rite or the new rite, you're still a priest. And it's almost like you're saying something was deficient in your ordination in the Novus Ordo, that you get these great, that you can now only get apparently by going through these extra prayers that were left out, or that were removed in the rite of ordination. Quite frankly, I think a borderline superstition, if I may be so blunt. And because it's like some magic words you need. No, either you're either ordained in the Novus Ordo. Let's say if you're ordained in the Novus Ordo, you're either ordained in the Novus Ordo or you're not. There's no middle ground here, And it seems to me as though you are de facto or ipso facto saying that somehow I'm lacking in my priesthood if I don't have these special prayers with a bishop present said over me, And moreover, if we're going to think this way, you can keep on going. Well, what's so special about the 62 Missal? What about what about the Missal under Pius XII? What about the actual books from Trent? Let's go wait a minute. What about the first century? The apostles were actually doing it then. Where do we go from here? It just seems like it's going to be if we're getting into this line of thinking, it goes back to this never-ending pattern of what is better. What is the official magic words that we could say? Like I said, it's borderline superstition. And unfortunately, this is going on. I am aware of this effort. I will not reveal names, but I will say that chancery offices have received missives about it, and even the papal nuncio has officially been informed of it. This is very serious. This is not a laughing matter, and it involves some very influential people. I'll go so far as to say that. And I probably shouldn't go any more than that. But I have problems with this. I really do, for a number of reasons, among them being the ones that I just said.
What
so I don't
about,
know if you maybe add to that or.
Well, you made that distinction there: ex opere operato, ex opere operantis. Some are going to say, well, that applies here. They're going to try to argue that there's some kind of subjective disposition that could be better oriented to receiving grace. You're validly ordained, but some are maybe more better disposed than others, and the particular form of the liturgy of the traditional Latin Mass makes one better disposed. Why would you say that doesn't apply here, that distinction?
That's a tough one to answer, but I think to keep it simple, what's so special about these prayers in the 62 Missal and the rite of ordination from prior to the reforms? What's so special about these particular words? It sounds like someone's dodging an obvious theological problem here. And, you're either ordained or you're not. You're either a priest. If you're ordained in the Novus Ordo, you're either a priest or you're not. Just because you somehow feel like you've missed out on something that the 62 Missal had, or whatever ordination book that it goes to, take your pick. I'm sorry. I just there's a fundamental doubt there There's a doubt. And, as one guy once put it to me, if you doubt, you're out. How is this pleasing to God when you're borderlining superstition, saying I have to have these prayers by a bishop in a church to somehow get this juice? Something is not computing there. And when I hear explanations in terms of the ex opere operantis, I can't help but think it's just a dodge. I know this is a can of worms to open up, but I'll do it anyway. This is something that has crept up within certain traditionalist communities, and a parallel that is made is with the rite of baptism. In the old rite of baptism, there were various exorcisms that were in there. In the actual full-blown rite. And there are those who believe that when we lost those in the liturgical reforms, we lost a means for grace to be communicated in this way, especially in this day and age where we really could have used it. I hear about exorcisms, for instance, being on the rise. Well, maybe if they had this protection through these extra prayers, so the thought goes, maybe people would be better protected. So they make a parallel, and they say that there's something. So they make a parallel with this, with the question of the holy orders that we were just talking about. But these are two different sacraments. Two different sacraments. It's one thing if somebody wants to renew their baptismal vows, and they want to use the old rite for that. That's one thing. You don't, when you make your promises or vow as a priest, it's two things: respect and obedience to your ordinary. It's right there in the ritual. You promise respect and obedience to me and to my successors is how it goes. And so if somebody wants to be on a priestly retreat and they want to renew themselves in their priesthood in the sense of, ask God for like a burning heart, like Saint John Marie Vianney, whose heart I was actually privileged to see a couple of years ago with his relic came to where I was living at the time, and I was blessed to venerate this holy relic. So that's one thing. If somebody wants to do that, and they're sitting in the pew and they find some of these prayers in the 62 Missal to be really beautiful, and they're just sitting in the pew privately and they're doing this, and just asking God to give them a greater love for him and for his people. We can talk about that. I think that might be fair. But in the specific context of you have to have a bishop, and let's say, for instance, for example, the bishop is leading this and people are doing these things. I'm like, what do you think is deficient somehow in your graces, in your priesthood? There's a line, and it's hard to define that line because this is a difficult area of sacramental theology. But I find it problematic because if you're doing it in the way that I originally spoke, it sounds to me as if there's some kind of a doubt there. Mm-hmm. You're doubting something. And I think that's offensive to God because you're starting to cross lines of the indefectibility of the church and the rites. And you're either ordained a priest or you're not. And Holy Mother Church cannot err gravely at the very least with respect to these matters. It just can't happen. So if you're doing this, you're opening yourself up to a world of hurt. And I don't really know if that distinction of the operantis versus operato applies here, because I think there's more issues surrounding it than just that. For instance, if you're doing this in the spirit or kind of an understanding of something, I didn't get something, and you're going to go through this, I can't help but think if that might be displeasing to God. And would God do this, cooperate with this? That's a question to be asked.
I can see the distinction applying to how much I may personally merit when I receive a sacrament, but I don't see it applying to comparing two forms of the liturgy. Two different things officially promulgated by the church. I don't
Mhm.
see it applying there. That seems to then impugn the current liturgical decisions of the church, the official promulgation of the liturgy and the liturgical reforms. It seems to undermine it. The other day somebody sent me this documentary about the traditional Latin Mass that they're making, and I watched the trailer, and there was a lady there who was saying she just had her baby baptized in the old way, in the old rite. Yeah, although that's not, I'm not sure exactly if that's the term they put it, but in the traditional Latin Mass, well, not Mass, but the old rite of baptism, I guess we can just put it that way for lack of a better term. Well, they had the baby baptized that way, and they thought, you know what? I really wish I had known about this when I was received into the church. I wish I could have, been received this way. And there's this implicit passive aggressive attitude towards the new way of doing things, or I should say the reformed way of doing things, as if it offers less. And I want that. I want more. I wish I would have had it done that way. It seems to just put shade, if you will, or cast shade on the liturgical reforms. And it also again assumes that I'm kind of missing out on something here. Um,
Yeah, and we could. I mean, there's room for theological discussion done in charity
mhm,
to discuss about should this have happened?
yeah.
Did somebody overstep their bounds? So, for instance, I happen to be of the opinion that I think that the prayers after Mass, the orationes post missam, with where we have the famous Saint Michael prayer. I wrote the world's leading book on the subject of that prayer. Well, it was done away with Inter Ecumenici, paragraph 48J, I think. It said they were to be suppressed or omitted. I can't remember which verb it is. Um, the prayers after Mass. And they cited Sacrosanctum Concilium, paragraph 50, I think it was, 54, somewhere 50 or somewhere into there. I have to look it up. And I looked that paragraph up, and it simply said that the rites of Mass were to be simplified. And I think the Latin was simpliciores. And I said, but wait a minute. The orationes post missam are exactly that, the prayers after Mass. If you're citing SC 50, I'll just say 50 for the sake of argument, SC 50 is your authority for this, and that rubric is talking about, or that command is saying the rites of Mass, then how do the prayers after Mass, how does that justify this? Now that's an open question. It's fair. It's done in charity. I'm not knocking on, doors, screaming at the Pope, holding banners saying, bring back the St. Michael. Some parishes do it anyway. Like my parish happens to do it here in town. But I'm not, raging against the machine on that matter. But I do think it's a legitimate question to ask, done in charity. And say, well, okay, did somebody miss the memo here? I don't know. But if you're going to cite a specific authority as your justification for getting rid of those prayers, and that text doesn't technically support it, there are some questions there. So, like I said, we could talk about whether something was a good idea or not, or maybe was that what the council intended versus what we got. Those are all fair questions to ask, but there are limits, and the major limit is, as St. Augustine puts out, if you're going to have these kinds of discussions, they have to be done in charity,
Mhm.
and I don't always see that happening. Yeah. I'm sorry. I think I cut you off. Sounded like you were going to say something.
No, no, you're good. And I find that this is becoming an issue because I'm seeing people assuming that somehow the old form of baptism in the Roman Rite may offer more grace. I'm seeing people saying the same thing about the Mass. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots and say, you know what? The rite of ordination, too. There has to be a difference here. The rite of ordination in the prior to the liturgical reforms offers more grace objectively than the new way of doing things. So I might need to, if I'm a priest ordained in the Novus Ordo, I'm validly ordained, but I might need to get more juice, as you put it. Might need to get supercharged and go and get some of these extra prayers that were said in the old way of doing things that are not said in the liturgical, in the Reformed Mass, and
Yeah,
go and avail myself of those things.
yeah, and I can confirm that these are some of the things that are going on, and I'm concerned for a number of reasons. Among them being that I also tend to think that it could lead to spiritual pride. First of all, actually when you had the poll on Twitter, I was actually really happy. Peter Kwasniewski responded, and he basically made the argument. And about full disclosure, I know Peter. He and I are both fellow oblates to the Monastero di San Benedetto in Norcia, Italy. And so, he and I are, we're good to one another. I love Peter. And but I think he really offered a great help to the cause, if you will, of this discussion when he said that people that do these things he simply called them confused. And I thank him for that. I thought that was really, really fitting. I think it was on Facebook, I think, that he talked about that. I have to give him some honor there because I was like, bingo, So traditionalists, there are those with good minds that understand this. And thankfully, I know a lot of good ones, and they are top-notch people that they would, if they heard about this, they'd be like, well, yeah, that is kind of a problem. So I was going to say something else, and I'm drawing. Oh, but yeah, but with respect to things like it can also lead to spiritual pride, I think, because if you think now that somehow you're a supercharged, juiced up priest because you've had these extra magic words said over you in a borderline superstitious way, somehow, if you think that you are now a better priest than your fellow Novus Ordo priests, brothers, that's I mean, you've just opened wide a very, very bad opening to the devil to walk through. Now, I'm not saying that people have done this or that this is the case with everybody. I'm not saying that's going to entirely depend upon on the subjective disposition of the person. But I do think it is a very distinct possibility, and I'm concerned about that. You're either a priest or you're not. You're not somehow better. The only thing that makes you a better priest than another priest is how faithful you are to the vocation. And remember, even though objectively, the holy orders is a higher calling than the sacrament of marriage. If somebody lives the sacrament of marriage more faithfully than you do as a priest, or bishop for that matter, or deacon, they will have a higher place in heaven. St. Gregory the Great talks about this in his Regula Pastoralis, if I remember correctly. So, and it's even St. Jerome talks about the hierarchy of vocations, and in one of his letters, I think it was to Eusticium, I think. So it's, yeah, I mean, these are the issues that come up, and so I mean, I understand, I get it. I'm not without sympathy and stuff, and I'm not going to sit there and be all imperious and go, j'accuse, I accuse you of something. I'm not trying to do that, but I am concerned for some of the really, really serious potential ramifications of all of this.
Well, I imagine, some priests who would do something like this would have to do so without their bishop being made aware, unless it's their bishop who's offering this supplied ritual for supplied grace, or however you want to put it. Unless it's their actual bishop, which is doubtful, offering this ceremony, they're probably having to go to a bishop that does this without the other bishop's knowledge. unless of course the bishop gives permission. But I guess I just don't see that happening.
I don't know why
With
they would. If there's a sacramental
yeah,
theological issue here, I don't any bishop worth his salt, I don't think would grant permission.
that's what I'm saying. I don't see them granting that permission, and if they would grant it for some odd reason, why wouldn't they just do it themselves? So, um, I think it would also involve issues there of doing things like that behind your bishop's back, with the intention of getting more grace. I'm not sure that it works like that.
If you
Um,
promise obedience and respect to your bishop and you're doing this behind his back, and yet you're somehow anticipating more grace to be given to you by God, you see where I'm going with this?
I think that this mentality eventually is going to lead a person away from the church. If you really believe that, if you've lost confidence in the church to the extent that you believe that its reformed liturgical expression doesn't offer you as much for your priesthood than it used to, your
Mhm.
confidence in the church has significantly decreased. It's only a matter of time before you connect the dots and just say, I'm in the wrong church. I need to go elsewhere.
Yeah, like I have to give a personal story here. It kind of fits in with everything. Um, I was privileged several years ago to be present at a there was a couple, a young couple. I won't say who they are. They were brought into the church. They were Protestants. I won't say of what variety or say what denomination. Pardon me. And they were officially welcomed back into the church using the old rite of welcoming. Now I happened to be sitting, I think it was the front or second pew there, front row, the one just behind it. So I had like direct line of vision. I was tearing up because it was so beautiful seeing this couple being welcomed into the church. It really did affect me. Like I got very emotional, not like weeping in the pew or anything, but I really was tearing up. I don't remember if I actually was crying like proper with tears coming down my face, but I was tearing up, and it was just so beautiful and so impacting even on me. And I'm a convert myself. I've been Catholic now a little over 24 years. And so I remember what it was like when I was brought into the church. It was different. I was baptized because the baptism I received was not considered valid by the Catholic Church, so I had to be rebaptized. Um, and this was during the Easter Vigil. And so I thought that the ceremony that I had witnessed, this was about within 7 8 years ago, I think. Because it was beautiful, and I was like, wow, like I mean, and there was specific, renunciation of error and this, and this. And it was really, really beautiful, I thought. And that was really triggering within me a greater appreciation and a devotion to God. And I can appreciate that. I get it. That's what it was. That's what it's designed to do. Uh, Holy Mother Church, in her wisdom, has seen fit to change things. We can debate whether or not we can 60 years after the fact we could sit here and say well, was this good or not? And that's, again, as I said, a legitimate thing, but a legitimate conversation to have in charity. But so again, I'm sympathetic. I understand. I wish I could see this for everybody. Being brought in that specific way. But it's not then to sit there and say that how things are done now is like defective. I don't know if I'd go that far. You know, I
Well,
just don't know.
pretty much every argument that I've ever heard to say that the um, traditional Latin Mass offers more grace objectively than the Novus Ordo, I can just apply to the liturgy of St. James, one of the Eastern liturgies, and I can just compare it then to the traditional Latin Mass. Every argument that I've heard, I can just apply to now compare the Roman Rite itself as expressed at the traditional Latin Mass. Compare that then to one of the Eastern liturgies. And what conclusions would you come to then? Are you going to say that the Eastern liturgies offer more grace because they have longer prayers, and there are certain things that they have that we no longer have in the Roman Rite? Is that the conclusion that we're going to adopt? Oddly enough, whenever I've asked the question to some radical traditionalists, they say, yes, actually, that is the conclusion that I could adopt. So it's just, oh, okay, well, it was meant to show you that's an absurd conclusion, but you want to
Mhm.
adopt an absurd conclusion, go ahead. But there are those who maintain that, and that would then really um, impugn the Roman Rite as a whole, and I'm not willing to do that. I don't believe anything that the church has officially promulgated liturgically, as far as rites or expressions of a rite. I don't believe that any of them offer more or less grace than another. Um, and I think to say so would be to then undermine our confidence in the church itself and would lead to other problems later on. Your thoughts?
Well, when I became Catholic in '97. 4 months later, I was at a summer camp in up in New Hampshire, and there was a Benedictine monk who was the chaplain for those 2 weeks, and he's also a rather famous liturgist. And the way that it was Novus Ordo, and the way that he celebrated the Mass was just so beautiful and very, very reverent. It was at those 2 weeks is when it finally like clicked with me. We were having it was adoration. I don't know if it was specific holy hour, but it was adoration at one point. And I was sitting there in the pews, and all of a sudden just clicked with me. Jesus in the Eucharist. I believed it. I professed it 4 months prior at my baptism and all that. But now it was real. It was very much real to me. I now got it. Like so I remember, I actually remember the feeling. Something clicked here to here, somewhere through here, and I was like, "Oh my goodness!" And now all of a sudden, like that was a life changing moment, and it has guided much of the direction of my life with respect to the Eucharist since then. Um, it's like, okay, yeah, I get it. I don't question this, and how it was done. Well, it may had a lot to do with it, but it was that reverence. It wasn't the question of the form of the mass or the form of the holy hour. It was so much as it was just like God decided to, like God worked. I don't know how to say this, but God gave me that grace to finally have this kick in. Um, and so when we talk about the rite of mass, you know, you're on a slippery slope. And a lot of people don't know this, but the slippery slope is actually a fallacy, a logical fallacy. People don't know that because oftentimes it comes true. uh, but something after the fact doesn't necessarily prove the original thing true. But it is considered a logical fallacy because this therefore that, or that therefore this, doesn't necessarily apply on the slippery slope argument, if I remember my logic class correctly. So I think that it leads to danger, and it could be impugning things. A lot has to do. I mean, I guess the way I would directly answer then your thought is, I think a lot's going to have to do with the interior disposition of the person. There are the people who have a very nervous disposition, and I say this in the old like 19th, early 20th century understanding of that expression. And they can get very, very wild. As a matter of fact, I'm seeing this happen now. I won't say who, but I'm seeing this happen now. Somebody who otherwise has a good mind and has good human formation, I'm starting to see them become radicalized because of their associations. If you have good people surrounding you, it goes a long way. So I think what you say is true, but a lot is also going to depend upon, I would just add to it and say that a lot is going to depend upon how far you take this, and that's going to, the people you surround yourself with. So when I was becoming Catholic, early Catholic, I managed to find good, or God, I should say, really, God put good people into my life to help me see through some things. And I had some weird experiences too, but I had good people surrounding me. And I try to have a very good Catholic sense about me, sensus Catholicus. Not a lot of people have that benefit. And so when I come to the chat room sometimes here and I see people talking in the chat room, I see myself in them. I see my early self, as it were, my early Catholic self. Some of these guys, from what I can tell, they seem very young and they're striving, they're searching for these answers. It's that millennial generation, or the no, what's that? The Homelanders, they're calling them. There's the Homeland generation, and then, which is roughly that period of time right around 9/11 and thereafter. Hard to believe that was 20 years ago, by the way. And they're searching for these answers. Do you mind if I throw some shade at somebody?
Up to you.
I'm going to throw shade. This is one of the reasons why, like, we have such a dearth of leadership, and I say this with all due respect, but we have such a dearth of leadership in the church, and this is why people like Taylor Marshall are so popular, because they take strong stands. They're leaders, but really, all that they're really giving you, though, is the spiritual crack candy. They're not actually giving you the real meat and potatoes. They're really not. And it bothers me for a number of different reasons. Among them, I'm just saying, I look at people, and what I knew one person in particular, they get so radicalized by these things, and they're very imbalanced. They become imbalanced. And it hurts me because I'm like, oh my goodness, like, no, that's not how this is supposed to work, and so, I throw shade at Taylor Marshall specifically because there's a lot of danger there. I could have seen myself going in that direction if I didn't have good people surrounding me, if God didn't put these people into my life. And so I think what you say is a good argument. It's something certainly that's on the table to talk about. But I would add to that and say, good people will help steer you away. And that's one of the reasons why I started, watching your channel. I encourage people to watch your channel, because I say to people, I'm like, this guy, he gets it, that he's not into the sensationalism stuff. Like, you actually talked about just the other day on one of your programs. You're like, we could do the sensational stuff, but that's not how you roll. I forget how you said it, but that's basically what you were driving at, that's what I find is very attractive, is you have no problem talking about reason and theology. You're not there to just give simple, cheap answers or sensationalize things. You're actually giving the authentic stuff. You're bringing on good people, to actually sit and provide this guidance for people that they're desperately craving in the church now, And I think that problem is low because we have a lack of true spiritual fathers. Church Militant a couple of weeks ago just had a seminary, former seminarians panel. Heartbreaking. I sat and listened to it. It was an hour and a half. I sat and listened to every gut-wrenching second of it. And I say to myself, just what a loss. What a loss. It's sad. But we don't have a lot of good spiritual fathers nowadays. And it's tough. It's hard. And people are desperately searching for that. They're looking for that in their own lives. Maybe, they're deadbeat dads or whatever. And then they turn to the church, and then they see the latest sex scandal coming up. It's terrible. And people don't know who to turn to. And I mean, I just, people that they turn to then are the ones that seem to have the largest megaphone and are shouting the loudest. That's actually the wrong way to do it. You go for the quiet people. You go for those that are, like you and others that are just talking about these things. So if we surround ourselves with good people, I'll just reiterate it. We surround ourselves with good people, know what it means to have a good person, first of all, how to find them. And I know it's a problem in and of itself, but, we need to be out there. We have to be there for people. So I don't disagree with your point. I would just add that point that I made to it to kind of round it out a little bit more.
There's a question here from Hunter. Can the new sacraments be objectively less disposing to individuals to be can the new sacraments be objectively less disposing to individuals to be disposed towards God? where I land on this one is I would say objectively the same amount of grace is offered to you. You subjectively, however, may perceive a particular liturgical expression and better way than maybe some others. For example, when I first converted to Catholicism, I was subjectively more disposed to the Novus Ordo and less disposed to the traditional Latin Mass. Both offer me the same amount of grace objectively, but personally, and arguably due to some misunderstandings on my part at that time, I was less disposed to the traditional Latin Mass. After studying the issues further, when it comes to the liturgy, that flipped, and I became much more disposed towards the traditional Latin Mass and much less disposed towards the Novus Ordo. Continuing to study further, and I had to even reform that. So we can say that maybe an individual, rightly or wrongly, could perhaps be subjectively better disposed to one expression of the liturgy than another, Latin Rite, Eastern Catholic, whatever. Um, but objectively, the same amount of grace is offered. We have to remember there are some people who actually find the Novus Ordo more suitable than the traditional Latin Mass. I know that sounds insane, but there are actually people who perceive it that way, and there are reasons why they perceive it that way, especially if they come from a Protestant and Reformed Protestant background. Some are going to take that position. Not all. Some people who come from the Reformed perspective go straight into the traditional Latin Mass. So it's not just everybody is just one particular way. So I say all that to say I think that we could subjectively be better disposed to one form or another, rightly or wrongly, but objectively we can't say that is the case. What do you think here? Where do you land on it? Your thoughts?
Do you still have the question up again, please?
Can the new sacraments be objectively less disposing to individuals to be disposed towards God?
The sacraments themselves? No.
Yeah, right.
No. The ritual surrounding it is we could have an intelligent discussion on, but the sacrament itself, no.
And I think what they're asking is, okay, the traditional Latin Mass, could somebody argue that it objectively straight from the get-go, outright offers you more grace by disposing you better to the grace than the Novus Ordo objectively considered? I think that's what's being asked.
If the extraordinary form has basically better opportunities to dispose
because of the pomp and because of the longer prayers and what they're asking for, and because of the this and that and the liturgical garments and blah, blah, blah.
The first extraordinary form at Mass that I attended was I'll actually name it St. Boniface in Pittsburgh. I was just beginning my MA studies at Franciscan University of Steubenville at the time. I was there with at least one, maybe two of my college friends. And the organist was playing a song. I don't remember what it was. And I was sitting there in the pew, and all of a sudden this older gentleman stands up, goes into like the center aisle up near the altar, like the sanctuary, like where the front pews would meet that little walkway before you go to start walking the sanctuary. And he shouted at the organist and said, and if I remember his words correctly, it was something to the effect of play that song on your own time. This is the Latin Mass, not the Novus Ordo. Play that song on your own time. I actually remember how he ended it. That was the exact way he said it, on your own time. I sat there and I'm like, what in the world did I just see? So I don't know about him, but he apparently didn't like whatever song that poor woman organist was playing. But I think it was a female. I just got like, wow, okay, what am I in store for next? In other words, that was scandalous. He didn't know that this was my first time there. I don't know my rear from my elbow, about it. And I'm seeing this angry guy get up here, and I'm like, I've never seen this before in the ordinary form, You know, now the rites. Now, Chris, that's a para question. That's not the rites proper. I haven't really studied the specific rituals in and of themselves, but I do think there's a lot of beauty in them. But I also think there's beauty in the Novus Ordo. I was at St. Agnes in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, not Minnesota, a few years back, and that was Monsignor Richard J. Schuler's old stomping grounds before he died. May he rest in peace. Um, and they did they celebrated the Novus Ordo so beautiful. It was almost indistinguishable with the extraordinary form, actually. I was really like, wow, like I didn't know that this could be done, you know. Now, some of it I thought was a bit excessive. They're constantly turning and bowing like every 5 seconds. I was like, okay, this is a bit overkill, you know. You've made the bow, you made the genuflection. Okay, now we get it, you know. But still, you know, it was like, wow. So what are we putting into this? You know, are we treating it haphazardly? Like, how many of us have seen priests give the blessing like this? Well, that's more Byzantine, but more like this, proper, or like, you know, and actually get the limp wrist when they're doing it, you know. That bothers me. That's not exactly very nice, but that's the ars celebrandi of the priest, you know. I think it's hard for us. I'll answer officially this way. Having set up all this as background, I'll answer this way. I think it's hard for us to know how the ordinary form can be done beautifully because so few of us actually see it done beautifully and in accordance with the great tradition. So until we see that done more often, you know, it's hard for us to make comparisons. So because there's no real way to gauge it at this point because we don't see it done. You know, there's no. I mean, unity almost seems to be lost with respect because like different priests do it like 1,000 different ways. You know, so it's hard for us to make that comparison.
And thank you, River Run, for the super chat here. I'm not sure I follow the question. Have we considered that the idea that the priest must facilitate a good liturgical experience is just active participation?
That's a question more so, River, of the ars celebrandi, which can facilitate people. So if you have a priest who's really reverent and really into this, like, I mean, I've been blessed to see that myself with the Novus Ordo. That's like, you can see this happening. You know, our God-given reason sees this and it inspires faith within us and we can go deeper. Now that's attractive. That is where we kind of, but it begins in that case with the ars celebrandi in River's example, and it then kind of kicks in the actuosa participatio that he was talking about on the part of the laity. Now, of course, he himself is already doing all of this with his own because he's the priest doing everything. But when it comes to the relationship with the laity, I would say that if you have a priest who understands these issues and is very reverent and truly is himself drawing deeply into, I hear it said, for instance, St. Padre Pio, whenever he would draw close to an altar, he would go very, very slow and haltingly the closer he got to it. Somebody asked him why, and he said to them, "Do you know what takes place on that altar?" You know, in other words, you have to approach it with that reverence and that fear and the mystery. And if you don't, you just treat it like it's just, you know, some random object. It's not going to be really inspiring. But if you instill that reverence, it's going to draw people, and it assists the actuosa participatio.
This is one from Millhavel. Thank you for the super chat there. Wouldn't the lack of an explicit epiclesis and less scripture in the TLM actually make this idea self-defeating? I think there's something to be said there. Now, of course, other people are going to say, well, it's not just, you know, that more words are said. It's also what is being said. But again, I can apply that to the liturgy of St. James, and so it doesn't hold water. But I think there is something to be said by what you're noting there. Yeah, we could argue that the traditional Latin Mass is implicitly an epiclesis, as you're noting there, but it does become more explicit in some of the other Eucharistic canons in the liturgical reform, and I think that's good. I think more scripture the better. That's also good. So those are some of the positive things that I could say about the liturgical reforms. What do you think about this? Where do you weigh in?
With respect to the specific question.
Yes.
All right, this is where uh, the I have to admit my knowledge is not as a liturgist proper and a sacramental theologian. I know that there's a lot of issues there, a lot of sacramental theology between the East and the West with respect to the epiclesis. But even it's there in the Roman Rite, but it's much shorter. Am I correct? I mean, I think you know more about this than I do. It's a bit shorter than it is and
Well, it's
less obvious than it
implicit.
is.
It's
Yeah.
implicit. I mean, there's nothing explicit.
Okay. Yeah, because I was always taught that it's when the priest puts his hands over the chalice and the Eucharist, what's soon to be the Eucharist, uh, and he calls upon the Holy Spirit. So it is very direct in the Novus Ordo. It's just not long, like it's not gussied up, I don't for like a better expression. It's it just happens really quick, right? And that's kind of like the main difference, isn't it? Between Eastern and Western liturgies, the epiclesis in the Eastern churches is a bit more.
On the Eastern liturgies, there's an explicit calling down of the Holy Spirit on the gifts to transform them, whereas in the traditional Latin Mass, it's not explicit. There's no explicit calling down. At best, you could say it's implied in certain parts of the prayers. Yeah.
And when they say that make this idea self-defeating, what do they mean by make this idea? The TLM offer more grace.
Well, they're effectively saying, well, some are arguing that the traditional Latin Mass has more to offer objectively, and they will note that there are longer prayers and things like that, and more explicit invocations and requests. And he's then turning it around and saying, well, wouldn't that then apply as a criticism for the traditional Latin Mass if we consider the fact that there's only an implicit epiclesis and only one reading for the one epistle reading, I should say.
Well, even in the Eastern churches, isn't there right for what we call in the West confession? The words like the absolution, isn't that also implied?
Yeah.
It's not like specifically ego te absolvo. It's more about like it's more of like a declaration, right? God has freed you from your sins, right? But it's implied, but you're still receiving the same sacramental grace, right?
Right. Same for baptism. The servant of God, blah, 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 is baptized instead of I baptize you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're still receiving the same grace of, in this case, with respect to the sacrament of reconciliation, you're being reconciled to God and His holy church. I guess I have to do a little more thinking on it. So I'm not gonna play. I'm not gonna play a guy with a doctor, but I haven't really thought much about it, so I'd have to kind of, study that question a little bit more, to be perfectly honest.
Sure. And that's perfectly fine. And I really appreciate you coming on, Kevin, and doing this. This is really good. And, I'm glad we were able to discuss some of these things. And I imagine there will be some follow-up videos that we'll eventually be doing on this particular topic, at least with some of the things that were discussed today.
All right. It's quite likely. Yeah. I know we have the one on, I don't know if you want to announce the ones that are coming up, but I know we have the Fatima webinar on August 16th, I think at 6 p.m. Central, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then there was the one, we're going to do one on Vigano. I can't remember if that was this month or September.
I think that one was September.
Okay. Yeah. We get the one on Vigano and Fatima. He's really kind of gone off the rails. I'm sorry I have to say that, but yeah, that's going to be an interesting.
Yeah, a lot to be said there, and I imagine it's going to be on August 1st, so I imagine there's more that could be said by the time we reach August 1, with as active as he seems to be in commenting on issues. So stay tuned for that one.
Yeah, it's even today's conversation, this has a lot of import with respect to the Holy Father's recent motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes. a lot of people are angry and upset and hurt even over that motu proprio. And I see why. I understand why they are. But at the same time, what we talked about today, it also kind of puts a little like shed some accolades upon the Holy Father in a sense, because this is a problem. These are problems that have arisen, and they're not being dealt with. They're being kept in the silence and in the shadows. And he kind of shone a really big spotlight with this motu proprio. Like I have my respectful questions. Holy Father has said, he doesn't mind asking. He doesn't mind people questioning him, as long as it's done respectfully. And I would do that if I had an hour with the Holy Father. I would love to sit and talk to him about a couple of things. The recent motu proprio being among them. I do look forward to a document from the Holy See, because he talks about the liturgical abuses in the Novus Ordo. In that same motu proprio, I look forward to a document from the Holy See that begins to correct some of those abuses and say this shouldn't happen. This. I think that would be a very, very good thing to have, because there are a lot of people, I think, who need that.
Agreed, but another document isn't going to do a whole lot of good if we don't enforce it with discipline and excommunications and things like that. So.
No argument there.
Yeah.
I actually, real quick, that same priest that I mentioned, he was our chaplain for that 2-week summer camp. He was given Redemptionis Sacramentum under John Paul II, I think it was,
right,
to review beforehand. Yep. And he looked at and his review was very simple. He said, "This is good, but it needs more teeth."
That's what I've been saying.
You
can tell people to do the right thing all day long, but okay, when they don't do the right thing, what are we going to do then? And right now we're just ignoring it and letting people not do the right thing. And that's the problem. Again, I appreciate you coming on. I look forward to doing more. And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Of course, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Share this on your social media. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. Going to be adding some extra stuff on there. In fact, later on tonight. So check it out if you want to get access to extra content and also support what we're doing here at RNT. All right. Until next time. God bless you all.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.